Hello, hello. This is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for another week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today we are diving deep into the question of how much do audio engineers make in 2023? Right now, we are going deep into some reports that are released every year. I've been looking into this since 2011, tracking how much audio engineers have made every year, also how much music producers and musicians have made every year. And where are they getting these jobs, or where are they getting this work? What cities or towns or states or part of the world are they in? We're going to be looking mostly at the American market here. That's the data we're looking at is for the US, but I think that the averages here will be at least somewhat reflective and speak to general trends in the audio industry that I think are playing out throughout the world. So let me know if you're in the live chat, if you can see me and hear me. Great to have you guys here. We have some new members joining. Ant-Man, Felix, Skelton, Pete, new member, Liquid Seymour. Great to have you guys. And for those of you who are listening on the audio-only versions like Apple Podcasts or Spotify, consider giving us a rating and review. It really does help spread the word. Now, quick note up front is that I can tell you right now up front, and I will, how much audio engineers made this past year on average and median. You could also look that up for yourself on Google in like 12 seconds. So we're going to go a lot deeper than that. We're not going to look at just how much they make, but we're going to break it down by parts of the country, cities, states, and sectors of the economy. And I also want to give you some insights into how you might get started in audio engineering, how you might earn towards the higher ends of these incomes rather than the lower ends of these incomes, and a lot more. I actually just published an article about this today. Let's see if I can go into my web sharing tool here. And if I can bring this up, let's see if I can change my view. You should be able to see my screen in just a second. Let me see if I can make that work. Here it is. You're seeing my screen, and here's the article that we put out just today. Before I get right into the numbers, one quick shout out to our sponsors. I'm talking into a new microphone today, a LEWITT Pure Tube. Absolutely gorgeous sounding microphone. Just came out. Extremely low noise, especially for a tube microphone, but really for any microphone. Really tailored for vocals, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later on. Also, shout out to Soundtoys. They have special intro pricing on their new SuperPlate plugin, which you definitely want to check out. It is probably the coolest plate reverb plugin out there, and I will tell you why in a little bit. But for now, let's get right into the numbers. So, how much did audio engineers earn in 2023? Well, the numbers that come out in May of each year are really for the year prior. And these numbers I have here show us that the most recent data that we have, which was basically compiled through May of 2022 and now released in 2023, is that in the past year, audio engineers made an average of $75,000 in the United States. And the median income, which is sometimes more relevant than the average income, was about $60,000. But there's a bunch of problems with this data. And before I go into what we can learn from it, I want to give you a sense for what we can't learn from it and what it doesn't tell us. So this data comes from something that the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics collects every year. They basically send out a survey to employers. It's the Occupational Employment Survey. And this survey that employers are mandated basically to fill out says how much they paid workers who in the United States collect a W-2 form. These are people who are on payroll as audio engineers. So this doesn't necessarily capture the market for freelancers. And when we look at some of the data that includes freelancers, some of the freelance salaries there are a little bit lower, and we'll look at that data in a bit. But the most robust data we have is for this really mandatory survey from the OES. And it shows 13,420 audio engineers employed in the US in the past year. Now, my guess is that there's considerably more than 13,000 people employed doing audio engineering in the United States if you count especially freelancers and semi-pros, people who are kind of hobbyists who have a side hustle in audio engineering. Many of these people doing it kind of off the books or minimally on the books, running small businesses. There's such a small proportion of audio engineers that they might not get captured in the data that actually includes freelancers, because the data that includes freelancers, that is the Bureau of Labor Statistics calling people on the phone and they're like, what do you do for work? And most people go like, stop talking to me. I'm having dinner. Click. At least that's what I do whenever a telemarketer reaches out to me, whether it's for an opinion poll or pretty much anything else. And we don't have great data on freelancers. But I think that the data that we get for these employed wage workers is going to give us a good sense for just where and how much audio engineers are making. I want to give you some of the big trends up front, because some of the big trends here have been going on for a while. When I first started doing this report back in, I think it was 2011 was the first time I did this report. The number of audio engineers in New York City and Los Angeles was practically the same, practically 1-to-1. For every engineer in New York, there was an engineer in California working. By the time that we got to, let me double check my years here, I think it was about 2015, that number had changed dramatically. The ratio of audio engineers in New York versus California was more than 2-to-1 in favor of California. So we had this out-migration from New York to California. They were once neck and neck, and double checking my numbers here was from between 2011 and 2018, the ratio of sound technician jobs in California went from 1-to-1 to nearly 2.6-to-1 as workers left New York City for less expensive cities in California. I believe it was 2-to-1 by 2015 and 2.6-to-1 by 2018. And it has gone even further in that direction. It is 3.3-to-1 now. This is the highest it has ever been. 3.3 audio engineers in California for every one in New York. And like I said, just over a decade ago, the number of engineers in both states was basically the same. But another interesting thing has been happening is that audio engineers in more recent years have been moving out of California into other lower cost, lower tax states. The last time I did this report was in 2019. And at that point, we had a lot of audio engineers moving for places like Nashville, Tennessee, Atlanta, Georgia, Austin, Texas. And that was a significant pattern that was starting to occur by 2019. So you had all of these audio engineers leaving high-cost New York City to go to lower-cost cities in California. And then after that had really happened and it started to peak, the numbers actually started to decline for California audio engineers. They started to downtick for a year or two because they were starting to then move to places like Austin, like Georgia, like Tennessee, and other small markets. But then something happened in 2020 and the world kind of got frozen in place, right? We went into this, they call it pandemic lockdown period, where all of a sudden dynamics that were in motion, some of them accelerated, like the move to more remote work over in-person work. But some of them also got frozen a little bit in time. And one of the things that we've seen is from 2019 to the year 2023, we have seen audio engineers in Los Angeles compared to New York go from 2.6-to-1 to 3.3-to-1. So we've had an even additional migration of audio engineers out of New York City into California, particularly into Los Angeles. And there are also engineers who've been in California for a while, leaving California for these other lower cost, lower tax states. But there's been enough new migration out of New York into California that's offsetting the losses from California. Now, I've been harping over New York and California for a little while. We're not only going to talk about those places, we're going to be talking about incomes in other places. And incomes from audio engineers can be wildly different depending on what kind of thing you're doing in audio engineering. Are you in the motion picture industry? Are you doing music recording? Are you in video games? Are you in audiobooks? Or are you mastering? Are you mixing? Are you doing live sound reinforcement? There can be wildly different incomes in those different areas, and there's wildly different incomes in different states and different cities. But the reason I'm harping on New York and California is that although their market share, their share of the whole job market has shrunk, it is still close to 50% of audio engineer jobs are in just those two places, California and New York. All right, let me bring back up my screen share here, and let's bring up the data again. For those of you on the audio-only version, I'm going to narrate all of the pertinent numbers here for you, but for those of you who are watching the video version, you can read along with me. So, a couple things to look at here. What was the average hourly rate for audio engineers? $36. And this is national. Again, it changes when we look at states and we look at cities. But here's a really interesting thing where they break it down by percentile. The bottom 10th percentile of audio engineers are making $15 an hour. That's the bottom 10% of people employed who get a W-2 form, who are like on the books working in a place as their job. The bottom 10% of them are making $15 an hour, where the top 10% of them are making more like $65 an hour. For annual wages, we have the bottom 10% for those working full-time at the bottom levels, $31,000 a year. And at the top level, it's top 10%, $135,000, with the median being around $60,000. And this is why we have something where we have our average, our mean wage, our average wage is so much higher than the median, because those people who make more than the median, more than the middle salary, can sometimes make a lot more. And if we were to look at the top 10% of the top 10%, I would estimate that a lot of those people could be making $300,000 a year, $500,000 a year. And we're really getting to the, top 1 in 1,000 people instead of just the top 1 in 100 people. We could be looking at people who are potentially making in the $1 million range on audio engineering. That's uncommon, but it's possible. Now, you probably don't want to stake your whole life being around, being in the top 1% of the top 1% of audio engineers. But there are people, let's just think about the numbers. There are people who might be charging anywhere from $2,000 and up to mix a song. Some people might charge $5,000 and up, and it's not unheard of at the very highest levels of the industry for people to charge $10,000 for a mix. I think that's less common today than it was a decade and 2 decades ago, but it's not totally unheard of. And they might be sometimes, in some cases, making points on certain releases. We're talking a little bit more about a major label paradigm that is kind of fading, but it's still present. It's still there. And let's pretend you were making $10,000 a song and you mixed 180 of them a year. I'm not great at math, but I think that's about $1.8 million. So that's possible. Wouldn't be insane to think that there's a handful of people in the world making that much audio engineering. But I would say that in my experience, more of the upper end of audio engineering, people who are really successful, whose names you might be familiar with, they could be in this range of anywhere from $100,000 up into the $300,000 range and potentially into the $500,000 range at the very top of things. You have to remember the top 1% of Americans, they're earning something like $400,000 or $500,000 in a year. That's very uncommon, and many of the people in that top 1% are there just for 1 year and are never there again because they got into that the top 1% that year because they sold their house, right? So more realistically, the very affluent top end of this range is probably in that $100,000 to $300,000 area. But there are some people crushing it. Graham Cochran of the Recording Revolution. I remember reading an article where he was making like $1 million a month selling instructional courses, something insane like that. So there are always these outliers, but they are the exception more than the rule. Bringing it back to reality for a minute, mean wage $75,000 and then median $60,000. But let's break it down now based on the industry we're in. They can vary wildly. The motion picture industry, significantly higher incomes there than in sound recording for music and general audio production. In motion picture and video, so TV and film, we're looking at average wages, not of $75,000, but of $95,000. And then here in the sound recording industries, which is more indicative of music recording, those are more like $61,000, so closer to the median and below the average. So you have people in Film and video making more than the average, and we have people probably working more in music making less than the average. And then some of the lowest still are people working in radio and television, and they're down at $46,000, which is kind of the bottom quartile. So radio and television broadcast really declining salaries relative to other fields. There used to be some other things in here that have dropped out, but it's interesting to note that the highest paying audio engineer jobs here for salaried audio engineers have nothing to do with music or even with film and video. Look at these top paying industries for sound engineering technicians. Number 1, accounting, tax preparation, bookkeeping, and payroll services. That's what you got into audio engineering for, right? To do sound for accounting, tax preparation, bookkeeping, and payroll services. There are people working as audio engineers and in video in the financial sector who their salaries are higher than the average and for people in creative fields. So if you're really stressed out that you can't make the kind of living that you want doing all this creative stuff, I've met very many people in my life who've done let me rephrase this, who've made very good incomes for themselves working in things like corporate AV, where they might be helping put on events, live events for Fortune 500 companies, or they're doing some of this kind of stuff, accounting, tax preparation, bookkeeping, and payroll services, doing audio engineering maybe for things like live web streams, or they're doing some really boring webinar stuff in the financial sector. And their average salaries more like $110,000. But of course, the number of people employed in those areas is significantly less. Some of the other places, software publishers, averages there $110,000. People working in audio engineering as sound technicians in software publishing. Very small number of them doing it, but the average salaries there are more like $110,000. Miscellaneous manufacturing, I don't even know what to make of this, averages there $102,000. Here's a really interesting one that's been increasing. Again, small number of people employed relative to the whole, but the average salary of $97,000 for people in newspaper, periodical, book, and directory publishers. This, I'm going to say, is more the audio engineers who are employed in the world of creating audiobooks. And then after that, we have computing infrastructure providers, data processing, web hosting, and related services. So again, more kind of online or computer-oriented audio engineering. What exactly these roles are, it's not really specific, but they're put in this category of doing things around software and web development, $96,000. They're being sound technician jobs there. The two biggest categories for employment overall are motion picture and video industries, followed by sound recording industries. And one big change here is in past reports, years ago, I would find there being more people working in the sound recording industries and fewer people working in motion picture and video industries. And now there's more people working in motion picture and video and fewer in pure sound. So that has been a significant shift in the past decade here. So this is something else you want to think about. If you're getting into audio engineering, the likelihood that you're doing audio engineering in a field where there's video attached to the audio that you're creating is significantly higher than in the past. This could be in live streaming formats. This could be in, web stream formats. This could be in formats where people are creating YouTube videos or online video content and they need good sound mixes, whether that is of dialogue and set noise and all that stuff and Foley and all that stuff, or whether it's making music mixes for things that might be streamed live. So there is this video component that has been increasing in sound technology work substantially. There have been a few other major changes. Before we get to them, I want to look at the average salaries by state. One of the interesting things here that's happened since all these New York engineers have been moving from New York to California is it's actually driven the incomes up for audio engineers in New York. Now, audio engineers in New York make more than audio engineers in California. In New York, they're averaging $91,000 a year, where in California, they're averaging $89,000 a year. So both these two places, New York and California, $91,000 a year and $89,000 a year, both of these significantly higher than the average of $75,000 a year and significantly higher than the median of $60,000 a year. After that, our next three major markets that have the most audio engineers in them are Florida at $67,000 a year, Texas at $52,000 a year, and Tennessee at $49,000 a year. So those are our five big states for audio engineering. But one of the interesting things here is California, this is like 38% of the entire salaried job market for audio engineers is in California. It's been shrinking as a percentage of the whole, but it's huge compared to the other states. 11% of them are in New York. It used to be way bigger. It used to be like more than 25% California and more than 25% New York. Now it's 11% New York. But these next ones, Florida, it's like 6.5%, 7% of the market. Texas, it's like, 5% of the market. Tennessee, it's like 3%, 4% of the market. So this remaining 50% of the market is so diffused over the entire rest of the country. So even though I've been talking about New York and California, I don't want your takeaway from today's talk being, you have to move to New York or California if you want to be an audio engineer. Sure, there's more audio engineers in those places than there are audio engineers elsewhere. However, elsewhere in the country, you don't have to make nearly as much as they do in New York or California to have a decent quality of life. Even between New York and California, you see that the average salary in New York, $91,000, is higher than the average salary in California. And if we're to break it down even further on a city-by-city basis, you see that the highest salaries, period, for major metropolitan areas where there's a high concentration of audio engineers is in New York, where they're averaging almost $95,000 in New York City. In New York City metro area, almost $95,000, whereas in the LA metro area, it's about $85,000. So if you look at New York versus LA, New York audio engineers are making about 10% more than LA audio engineers. However, here's the rub. The cost of living is about 13% higher in New York City than in Los Angeles. So even though they're making 10% more, they might have 3% less disposable income in their pocket at the end of every month. So this is a big thing you have to consider. Where we're looking at Nashville and the incomes in Nashville, only $56,000, or the audio engineer incomes in Miami, $66,000, slightly below the average. The cost of living is so much dramatically cheaper in these places than it is in places like Los Angeles and in New York that often these things kind of even out. If you look at someone making $40,000 or $50,000 in Atlanta, Georgia, that person can easily be living better than someone making $90,000 or $95,000 in New York City. Trust me, I know, as someone who lived in New York City before moving to New Hampshire. When I moved to New Hampshire, I was like, oh, that's where all my money's been going. I get to keep some of it now. And New Hampshire has among the highest disposable incomes in the country because we have some of the higher incomes in the country and some of the lower costs of living. There are other markets like in Tennessee, like in Georgia, like in Texas, where you're not necessarily at the very highest of incomes in the country, but your cost of living might be substantially lower. So whenever you're looking at numbers like this, I really want you to take into account local cost of living and don't necessarily chase this idea of I have to go to Los Angeles or I have to go to New York because the salaries are higher there. That doesn't mean you get to keep more of your money. It doesn't mean you come out more ahead every month. In fact, in New York and New York City and Los Angeles, more than some other places in America, there's more of a culture of debt where more people are more likely to overspend, go into debt to live in the cool place. And even though they have a higher income, they might be keeping less of it, and they might be in less of a financially sound position than someone who's making 2/3 as much or even half as much in a more affordable market that also maybe has a little bit less of a culture of debt or a culture of keeping up with the Joneses. So that's something to think about. Particularly in California, you'll notice there that outward displays of wealth, even compared to New York, are very significant and somewhat ostentatious. In California, the last time I was in Los Angeles just for NAMM, it was so interesting to see these outward displays of affluence a lot of it in many cases powered by debt. And then right next to it, like tent cities of people living in tents underneath overpasses, which it wasn't that way in California even several years ago. So this is one of the other reasons we're going to get into real talk for a second. I'm also not going to try to convince you to move out of California if you're there, or move out of New York if you're there. But I do want to put into perspective that although California has kept its market share from 2019 to 2013, it's only dropped a little bit in market share of the total jobs. It's because people have been moving from New York to California fast enough to slightly offset or almost offset the number of people who are leaving California for other markets. But the really interesting thing that I've been seeing in this data, having looked at this data almost every year since 2011, is that the people who are leaving places like New York City and California, who don't go to California, or they're going from California elsewhere, audio engineers leaving California, going somewhere else, there's not one other destination they go. They're not all going to Nashville, Tennessee. They're not all going to Austin, Texas. They're not all going to Atlanta, Georgia. They're spreading out in so many different directions. And it really seems like that 50% of audio engineers who are not in New York and California, they're like everywhere else. The runners up of Florida, Tennessee, and what was our other big one? Florida, Tennessee, and Texas have such a relatively small amount compared to California that the next one's down below Tennessee. It's like California has something like, oh my goodness, I have to remember the number now, 38% of the audio engineers. New York has 11. Florida has like 6. Texas has like 5. Tennessee has like 3 or 4. And then every other place is stacked up around 1 or 2% until you get to the remaining 50%. But I do want to look at with you a couple of other interesting changes. And that is the change year over year from 2019 to 2023. There's been a lot of inflation recently, and are audio engineer salaries keeping up with inflation? That's another important question for us to ask. Let's take a closer look at that. So I'm going to bring up the article here because one of the problems with the data from the US government is that they don't really keep the old year's data accessible. Like, I have hyperlinks in all of my articles about this going back to 2011 that links to where the Bureau of Labor Statistics put all of their numbers. And if you click on them now, like, all of those links are broken. Apparently, the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't believe in like keeping their data from past years the way it was. They go back and they revise it and they update it and they change it and they remove the links, and you can never find what the data was when it was reported, back when it was reported. It's like the Ministry of Truth. You know, if you've ever read George Orwell's 1984, they're just constantly like revising history and deleting history. But I, at least on the SonicScoop website, have the numbers as they were released, when they were released from back then. And here's the change. The last time I did this report was in 2019. I took off from doing it during the lockdowns because things were weird and this data wasn't being released in quite the same way, and a lot of states weren't reporting properly. So there's this gap from 2019 until now. In 2019, the average for audio engineers, the median for audio engineers was $52,400. And in 2023, it's gone up to $60,670. So from $52,000 to $60,000 from 2019 to 2023. That's up about 16% from 2019. Unfortunately, the official inflation rate from 2019 to 2023 has been 19%. So audio engineers by the median have taken a pay cut of about 3% of their income. The same thing is true if you look at the average. The average salary in 2019 was $65,000. It had actually been static for a few years. From like 2016 to 2019, there wasn't really any increase in audio engineer salaries. It was actually kind of going up and down and staying around the middle. And a lot of people thought there was going to be a big recession, 2016, 2017, and then the whole world turned upside down in other ways. And in 2023, it went from $65,000 to $75,000 in 2023. 65,000 in 2019 to 75,000 in 2023. This is also an increase of about 16% if you look at the average. And unfortunately, that's slightly less than the cumulative inflation rate since then, as officially reported, which is 19%. So audio engineers have taken a little bit of a loss. It's actually been worse for people at the top end, interestingly, which I was surprised to find, than people at the lower end. The top 10% of earners, their salaries increased about 15% against about 19% total inflation, versus the bottom, which were up about 20%. The bottom 10% of earners, their incomes were up about 20% from 2019 against a 19% overall inflation rate. There's one other thing, though, I have to add to this, and that is that I can't really think of many prices in my life that have gone up by only 20%. Let me know. How are the prices of rent near you? How are the prices of houses near you? How's the price of gas near you? How are the prices of eggs near you, etc.? For me, I've seen prices go up by considerably more than 20%. And I think there are incentives, generally speaking, for governments to report lower inflation than there actually is. And chances are that audio engineers in real terms have taken a little bit of a pay cut in the past few years, if you want to get really into the weeds about that. There are a couple other key insights in this one, but before we get into them, I want to give you a few quick shout outs. But what you have to look forward to in the rest of this episode is I want to give you my list of how much you should be charging as a freelancer and how freelancer salaries are going to differ from these salary backgrounds. So these jobs that we've been looking at are salaried jobs. People who work for a company, they get a W-2 form. It's like, this is my job. I'm an audio engineer. I report into work and go to the office or work from my home office from these hours for this one company. Let's be real. That's not most of us in audio. That's not most of you listening to this right now. So how much can you be looking at making? How much will you be charging for different services like mixing, like mastering, like recording, like producing, like performing, like arranging? We'll go into some detail on that, and we'll look at the numbers that we have for freelancers, which is the larger part of the market. The only thing I've got to do before we do that is give the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors, our biggest, most important sponsor being you. How do you sponsor this podcast? Check out one of our great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Compression Breakthroughs, or Mastering Demystified. All of them come with a 30-day money-back guarantee. I know that you're absolutely gonna love them. They change the way that people's lives go. I mean this. Mixing Breakthroughs, people who have taken this course, they go like, Justin, thank you. This was like the most useful thing I've ever gone through, and my mixes immediately improved. I'm not joking that people take this course and within 3 weeks, they're mixing better than they ever have before. That sounds like it should be like a snake oil, like bold claim that can't possibly be true. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee on it. You try the course, and if you actually go through the exercises in the course and adopt the process in the course, if you're not mixing dramatically better within a month, if you don't believe that happened, just return it. No questions asked, money-back guarantee. I can't think of anyone who's gone through this course the whole way and has written to me like, Justin, I went through the whole course and I didn't get better at mixing. Every time I get an email from someone who finished the course, they're like, wow, I got better at mixing. So check out Mixing Breakthroughs, Compression Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified. But I also want to give a big shout out and thanks to sponsors on this month's episode. LEWITT Audio, or just LEWITT, are making some absolutely wonderful microphones. I'm speaking into their Pure Tube right now. The build quality on this microphone is insane. I literally just unboxed it before doing this episode. I was like, oh, this is cool. I'll try out a new microphone. It's a $1,200 microphone, so it'll be, kind of nice one. But that's, I've used $3,000 and $4,000 and $5,000 and $10,000 microphones, $1,200 microphone, whatever. The build quality on this thing is insane. It's absolutely beautiful. There's so many cool little features in it, just the way the shock mount is designed. I absolutely love this pop filter. They have this magnetic pop filter. It's just so cool, and everything is just so well built and well machined on these microphones. And this thing just this is my second time putting it on, and it just kind of pops into place. You probably heard a little bit of a click as I played around with the microphone, but it just pops into place. There's this super rugged shock mount, but the sound of it is really nice as well. I've just done some listening tests with it. Right now, you're hearing it through a little bit of multiband compression, a little bit of, there's a limiter on here, and I think there's like a low frequency roll off, but that's really all that's on the microphone. It's really designed for vocals, so it has the tiniest little hump up in the upper mid range, and then a really nice kind of extended little bit above 10K. So somewhere in that 10 to 14K area, there's just a little bit of extra air up there. Remarkably good specs, especially as far as noise goes for a tube microphone. And I got to tell you, it's one of those things where if you ever unboxed a product and like smiled, this totally experience I had of opening the case and I was like, oh, that looks cool. Just, I don't know. There's something about the little attention to detail in machining and quality on this one. It's really remarkable. It has a really nice small power supply that goes with it. Here, we'll scroll through some pictures of the Pure Tube. And of course, I get to look at this beautiful glowing tube while I'm talking into it. You don't. But if you are a performer or a musician who's singing into it, you get to be mesmerized by the tube. Here's some pictures of the mic. Really nice. We're actually going to be giving away one of these microphones. So stay tuned for that. If you have not signed up for the newsletter over at SonicScoop.com, please do. There's a newsletter sign up right here on the top right-hand side of your screen. And if you want to sign up for the newsletter, you will find out when our giveaway of this mic is going on. It's coming up pretty fast, and we'll have a 2-week period in which you can sign up to win one of these. We give away more than $100,000 of free gear every year, and this is going to be the next one of them. So make sure you sign up at sonicscoop.com/sign-up, or just go to sonicscoop.com and click the newsletter button at the top right-hand side of your screen, and we'll let you know as soon as the giveaway for this one is starting. Also, a quick shout out and thanks to our friends over at Soundtoys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Check out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. They've just come out with SuperPlate, and SuperPlate right now, there's a special introductory sale on it, I believe. This one is going to be selling for $150, but right now it's $79. I think there's also an upgrade path available for people who have the little plate, but this one is so cool. It has a new feature on it that I have not seen before on other plate reverb plugins. There's kind of this infinite hold option where you can have this ducking feature. Man, to go into the explanation of this, it's going to really derail the whole podcast episode, so I'm not going to give you the full explanation. But if you hit the tweak button on this, there's this whole array where you can set a threshold where when a new signal comes in, it clears the reverb buffer. So you can use an almost infinite style of reverb decay time, but then clear its buffer every time a new hit comes in. So you can get these really gorgeously long delays, but without a ton of extra clutter. And it's done in an ingenious way that is different from the way other reverb plugins have handled this in the past. So definitely something exciting and interesting to check out. Last quick pitch I want to give you in the sponsor section is think about becoming a member of this podcast. If for some reason you have not tuned out by now, you apparently don't mind hearing me talk. Well, if you want your questions answered by me, or you want mixed feedback from me, which has been extremely useful for a lot of our members, just click the Join Now button at the bottom of this video. The only place you won't find the Join Now button is on an Apple iOS device. There you might have to go into your browser or look for the links in the description. But if you join, it's only $5 a month, and you get access to exclusive live Q&As with guaranteed answers to your questions, guaranteed responses to your comments in the YouTube chats, and also entry into the mixed feedback sessions, where we'll give you real-time specific feedback on exactly what you can improve in your mixes, and you get to share your work with a like-minded community of peers where you're not only going to learn from your own mixes, but learn from the improvements we're going to make to their mixes as well. So some super useful stuff. All right, let's now get back into the meat of this week's episode. That's my email from our sponsors over at LEWITT. Let me clear that. And back to our default. All right. Did I remind you that this episode is totally live? So if I'm clicking on my screen, not knowing where things are, that's why. Okay. How much should you be expecting to make as an audio engineer, as a freelancer? Just by a show of hands in the chat, or if you want to write in the comments after the fact, how many of you have like a salaried job as an audio engineer versus you're making money as a freelancer? And then if you're making money as a freelancer, will you consider it full-time or part-time? And if you consider it just part of your income, what portion of your income would you say comes from audio? Really useful information for me to have. Feel free to put that into the chat or into the comments. And please share your story, and others will share theirs as well. But when it comes to those numbers, there is a totally different set of statistics. Here, I'll bring up my screen for you again. Called the OOH, the Occupational Handbook, I think is what the Bureau of Labor Statistics calls it. And here they have broadcast sound and video technicians lumped together. And when you put this whole category together, it says there's 120,000 of them in the United States. But if you just segment it down to the sound technicians subsection of this, then our numbers start to look only a little bit higher than the salaried numbers. I believe the numbers they had here were about 17,000 audio engineers instead of the 13,000 we saw from the other set of numbers. So we were looking at the salaried audio engineers, about 13,000 in the country. And then when we just subtract out sound-only engineers from broadcast sound and video technicians, they're saying that there is about 16 or 17,000 of those. So only slightly more once we include data that includes freelancers. But this data really isn't perfect. And from what I can see, this only sound audio engineering category of about $17,000, the way they define it is comparable to the way that they define sound engineering technicians in the occupational and employment statistics. But it's more similar. There's something like 2,500 salaried people. They have the number here, 2,690 salaried people in the just sound only portion of audio engineering. There's 2,600 here, and there's 16,000 in the numbers that include freelance data. Then all of a sudden we're comparing, say, 2,500 to 16,000. So it becomes closer to something like, hey, there's an 8-to-1 ratio of salaried people versus freelancers. And every time I've tried to look at this data in years past, I keep on coming to something in that range. And it's varied between 7-to-1 to 10-to-1 number of freelancers versus salaried people in audio. So if this reading of the data is correct, then it seems like there might be something like 13,000 salaried audio engineers in all of the United States, but there's probably something like a total of 60,000 to 130,000 audio engineers in total when you also include freelancers. But it's really hard to say that for sure because the definitions here are so open to interpretation and kind of so fudgeable. It's really hard to say. So maybe that's an overly generous estimate of how many freelancers there are on my part, but that's the best way that I've been able to break it down based on the assumptions that I'm making. I'm a nerd enough to have literally called up the Bureau of Labor Statistics in multiple years to ask them questions about this. And I've actually gotten people on the phone there, and they're actually like, oh, you want to talk to me about our data? Okay. And they're actually fairly knowledgeable about how they put this stuff together. But they give me so many caveats and so many of the kinds of caveats I'm giving you. That's like, oh, well, it's not really clear, or, that's a pretty broad category, etc. But based on the conversations I've had with them as well, those are the numbers I feel comfortable saying, that there's probably at least 7-to-1 freelancers versus salaried people working in audio. The average wages that include the average wages that include freelancers are lower than for the average wages of salaried people. So I believe it's about $75,000 here for salaried people they had as an average, and they had closer to $60,000 to $65,000 for once you start including the data for freelancers, once you get this phone survey data. But I don't want to put too much stock in that data because it literally consists of people from the US government calling up people and say, I know you're having dinner, but can you tell me what kind of work you do and how much you earned last year, do you think, roughly? And there's a couple of things going on here that could explain the lower wages from the phone call data. One thing that could explain it is when someone from the US government calls you asking you how much money you make, people are probably more likely to round down. This is a guess of mine, but I'm not certain. But one of the other reasons is once we start including freelancers, we might be including more and more of those people who make 10% of their income, 20% of their income, 50% of their income, 80% of their income off of sound engineering. It's a side hustle. It's a part-time job. It's something they do in addition to being a musician. So that might also skew down those numbers. So those are the realities to the extent that I understand them based on the data that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has. It's not a perfect understanding, but I think it gives more clarity than just looking at these surveys of audio engineer salaries and taking them as gospel. Now, I promised I'd get into the idea of how much you should be charging, because that's really what matters a lot more. And I've actually done a whole entire episode on this. It's called How Much Should a Mix Cost? And I put mix in there because when I put mix in the title of a video, it gets more clicks and views than if I put other words in there. But it really is about not just mixing, but I also give rates for mastering and some other things. I like to look at this in tiers. If we're looking at mixing specifically, and we're looking at it on a per song basis, I would say that there is the pre-professional hobbyist price of $0 to $150 for mixing. And at $150, you should expect to be giving people competent mixes, and you should expect to get a competent enough mix that's not like terrible. People are not going to go yelling at you for having given that mix. They're going to go like, oh, cool, great. We have our first EP recorded. Neat. You really start to get to a separate tier once you're charging $250 to $350. And this is why I would call the cusp of professional or the entry-level professional, people who are doing really competent work that is not getting in the way of the music and where things feel solidly professional, and the number of mistakes, significant mistakes, is few. These aren't necessarily extremely impressive sounding mixes that feel like they're going to stand up on a playlist with your favorite sounding releases. The next category of mixing, where people are pricing themselves who are competitive with big name artists who you're familiar with, or who work with big name artists who you're familiar with, that rate is more like $500 to $800 per song. And I think in that world of $500 to $800 per song, you're going to be getting pretty competent people where you're like, whoa, that sounds as good as other stuff on a playlist that we want to be sitting next to. That's the next tier for mixing. And then the next tier up from that, above $800, that tier of, let's call it around $1,000 to $1,500, is like the solidly pro level. I don't want to say B-list because that sounds derogatory, but they're not like the super A-list mixers who, like, a handful of them who's everyone knows their name. But these are the people who worked on a significant number of records that you've actually heard of or heard or enjoyed. And you're like, you did that artist and that artist and that artist and that artist. Often in that $1,000 to $1,500 range, you're going to find people who've worked on a whole bunch of records that you actually know, love, and enjoy. And then above that $1,500 range, when we start to get into that $2,000 and up range, and this could be $2,000 to $5,000 or $2,000 to $10,000. In those ranges, that's kind of where mixing maxes out. And the further up we go in these ranges, the fewer people we find. This doesn't work like a normal distribution. There are certain attributes in life that work on normal distributions, like human height, something like that. There's a normal distribution where people cluster together around the average and they kind of taper off at the extremes. But with things like income and the number of records that people have worked on, it is more of a Pareto distribution or like a power curve, where the higher we get into income, the fewer people there are and the lower down we get, kind of the more people stack up. So there's probably way more people offering $150 mixes than $250 mixes, and there's probably fewer people offering $250 to $350 mixes than $500, $800 mixes, and there's fewer of those $500, $800. I'm sorry, there's more of those 500. Let me make sure I'm saying this right. This is totally live. There's more people probably offering mixes at $150 than at $250 and $300. There's more people offering mixes at $250 and $350 than at $500 to $800. And there's more people doing mixes at $500, $800 than there are at $1,500 and $2,000. And there's more people offering them at $1,500 and $2,000 than there are offering them at $2,000, $5,000, and $10,000. Just like there's so many more records that sell 0 copies than there are records that sell 10,000 copies. And there's so many more records that sell 10,000 copies than there are that sell 100,000, and so on. So income is somewhat distributed in that way. And it's even more distributed in that way in a world like audio engineering, where a lot of people who are getting into audio and are thinking of making a go of it as a career stack up at around 0, because they're doing the work and they're making close to $0 a year doing it, because it's a passion, it's a hobby they're trying to get better at, and only a small number of those people who have those potential aspirations really stick with it to the degree that they're making something. So even once you start making $250 a mix in audio engineering, you are so far ahead of so many people who have a DAW and do audio engineering and who want to consider doing it as a possible vocation. Now, the wages for mastering, slightly different. I would say that you have, again, people who are doing this $0 to $25 range is probably the cheapest end of it. And then you have this maybe cusp of professional range of $50 to $60, where they're not making so many mistakes, but it just doesn't feel like your favorite records on your favorite playlists yet. And then we're really getting into the professional range with mastering, somewhere around $100 to $150. And you'll find a lot of good, competent mastering engineers who've done a lot of work that you're familiar with in that range of, $125 to $150 a track. And that sweet spot of, $100 to $150 a track, $125 to $150 a track, that's kind of like the audio engineers who are charging somewhere between $800 and $1,500 for mixes. And then there's this higher level of mastering engineers where they're doing so many of the biggest releases, and maybe those people are more in the $300 per track range. So those are the ranges more for mastering. As far as hourly rates, I think this is one place where we actually do get fairly good data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys here. So let me go ahead and bring this back up. And this is one place where I really think the market hourly wage for regular tasks is probably correct, where you have a bottom 10% of audio engineers, those people who are just starting their first jobs as assistants or runners or sound technicians at a really tiny club somewhere. They might be making $15 an hour or $20 an hour. That's entirely possible. And I don't think that that has changed very dramatically over the past decade or two. That at the bottom, $15 to $20 an hour is almost what you should expect if you're lucky to a degree, meaning lucky enough to actually be working in this field at all, if that's what your passion is. But then we're getting into this 50% area of $30 an hour. And here we're looking at people who are working at maybe kind of more small but not teeny tiny hole-in-the-wall venues, or are maybe doing slightly more serious work, like they have people who are relying on them to get a job done to actually turn it around. So this range of $30 an hour being in the middle, totally see that. And then you have these ranges of $40 and $60 an hour. So the $40 to $50 an hour range being the top 25, the top third, top 25%, top 33%, somewhere between $40 and $50 an hour. And these are people who are more experienced. They might be working at slightly larger venues. And then we have people making hourly rates of $65 an hour at the top 90%. I think there are some problems with this, though, as we start to get to the top, because the reality of people into the freelance world is that they're not getting paid for billable hours as much as they're getting paid for projects, and a whole bunch of the hours that they put in are not billable. So this is one of the problems once we get up into this higher end of the spectrum. It's saying that the hourly rate for someone making $100,000 a year is $47 an hour. Top 25% of audio engineers who are making close to $100,000 a year are making something like almost $50 an hour. But that's not quite how it works, is it? What's really happening there isn't that those audio engineers are working 40 hours a week just doing mixes or just doing recording at an average rate of $50 an hour. There's a good portion of those people who might be billing closer to $100 an hour, but are only working half of the time. And the other half of their time are things like business outreach. When you are a freelancer, an independent contractor, you have to bake into your income all these other jobs that are no longer being done by other people for you. So if you're working as a sound technician who is hired by an audiobook company to record audiobook voiceovers, they're doing all of the work of bookkeeping, keeping the facilities in order, finding you clients, interacting with the clients, finding out, what the clients want and, when's the booking going to happen. And a significant portion of these might be outsourced to other people, even if you're freelancing and you're running a small business. But a significant portion of these things are being taken care of by you. Now, the other benefit here is now you don't have to take the income that's coming in and share it with so many other people. So the reality for you as a freelancer is if you're looking to hit $100,000 a year, it might not come from $50 an hour working 40 hours a week in billable hours. It might come from $100 an hour, billable hours, still working 40 hours a week, but only 20 of them are really billable hours. So I hope that makes sense. That's one of the big distinctions between salaried work versus freelance work. In salaried work, there's some big company that's getting in all the money, and then they have your role, and they're paying out a portion of that money to you, the employee, and they're keeping a portion of it for themselves. You, as the freelancer, can charge that higher rate that would go to the big company. You get to keep it all yourself, but it has to be a higher rate because if you're doing all these other things, not everything in your week is going to be billable hours of actually mixing or actually recording, etc. And if you want to be in the studio just recording or mixing or whatever, 40 hours a week or 80 hours a week, then you're either going to have to work an insane amount, or you're going to have to start hiring other people into your business. And now you're starting to share some of the income with them. So now your hourly rate starts to go back down a little bit. And now you become the employer hiring these other people to do rates, and you're giving them a cut of what's coming in. You've turned them into the salary position. So that's something that you have to think about. If you're going to be a freelancer, if you're going to make your own life in audio engineering or music production, which many do, you have to think about more like a business owner than like an employee. Because if you come in with an employee mindset to running your own audio engineering business, it's not going to work out quite as well for you as it could. All right, well, I hope this episode has been useful for you. Let me know in the comments down below, are there any aspects of this whole money and music thing that you wish I had gone into that I didn't? You want to share your own stories, please let me know in the comments or in the chat. I read every single one of them. really great to have you guys here for this one. I want to give another big shout out and thanks to LEWITT for giving me this pure tube microphone to use for this episode. Check them out over at, what is their website? Is it lewitt.com? It's just lewitt-audio.com. That's lewitt-audio.com. You can actually hear sound samples of this microphone on their website. And I'm impressed by it. Just my first day unboxing it today. And again, we're going to be giving one of these away soon over at SonicScoop.com. So sign up for the newsletter there. And big shout out and thanks to Soundtoys for sponsoring again, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Last but not least, consider sponsoring yourself. Check out one of the great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Compression Breakthroughs, or Mastering Demystified. If you want to mix or master efficiently so you can get a good hourly rate, and if you want to have the skills that allow you to not charge $0 to $150 for a song, but get into that bracket where you can charge $250 to $350 per song, and then $500 to $800 per song, and then $1,500 per song and more, Mixing Breakthroughs will absolutely help you do that. Not only get those higher rates, but keep more of that in your pocket by having a more efficient process. If you want to diversify into mastering, check out Mastering Demystified over at masteringdemystified.com. Last but not least, Compression Breakthroughs will teach you everything you need to know about compression, how to hear it, how to use it like a pro. All of them come with a 30-day money-back guarantee. And if you want to go even deeper, if you have specific questions about your own career trajectory, what you should do, think about becoming a member. Hit the join button down below. Our next Q&A episode is coming up very shortly. I believe it's coming up next week. And then shortly after that, we're going to have our next mix feedback session. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have about your specific case in those live Q&As. Hope to see you in the next members live Q&A. Click join to check it out. Thank all of you guys for joining us. Or thanks to all of you guys for joining me, is what I should have said. My goodness, I'm stepping over my words today in this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. I hope you've enjoyed being with me for this one. I think I did way too much reading and looking at like numbers and statistics. Now my brain is tired, so none of my words are coming out right. But I really appreciate you guys putting up with and enjoying my company for this episode of the SonicScoop podcast. I've enjoyed yours. See you next time.